floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. The first thing I'd like to do is to reassure you all about America. It's said about the American political system, it was designed by geniuses so that it could be run by idiots. And, never has that perhaps been more apt than what we see today when you have candidates mistaking Hamas for hummus and things like that. If we look at the presidential debate, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the candidates and where they're going, but then I want to frame it within how the debate about foreign policy in America, which is coming to light in the presidential debates, how that affects US-Israeli relations, how America looks at Israel. And I'll contrast that a little bit with how Britain looks at Israel, so you get a sense of it. And some of it will be taken from my book, which was published this year by Cambridge University Press and is available on Amazon. Okay, so if we look at the two parties, if we start with the Democrats, because it's much easier, there's really only two people in the race. One is Hillary Clinton and the other is Bernie Sanders. What you see is Bernie Sanders representing a large part of the base of the Democratic Party. And the base of the Democratic Party is more to the left than the American public on everything. So what you see is that the Democrats were in favor of the Iran deal. The majority of the American public were not. And actually on this, a majority of American Jews were in favor or evenly balanced on the Iran deal. So Jews were more favorable to the Iran deal. Jews are the most liberal element, liberal in American parlance is left, yes, than non-Jews in America. So Sanders plays to the base, and he's mainly concerned with domestic change in America, that Wall Street is too powerful. Special interests are too powerful. And Hillary is really the foreign policy expert. And the debate there is between Bernie Sanders, who takes a less interventionist, less internationalist approach, and is less assertive, less willing to promote and push American leadership and American power and American military intervention. So, for example, he's not interested in toppling Assad. He's not interested in no-fly zones in Syria, which is one idea that's currently doing the rounds to protect civilians from Russian bombings and also to prevent refugees leaving and things like that. Hillary's in favor of a much more assertive approach to Russia, a much more assertive approach vis-a-vis Assad. And this isn't just what she said. This is what WikiLeaks showed that she promoted while she was Secretary of State. And she's in favor of no-fly zones. She's in favor of American leadership. And she is more centrist on domestic politics. And so she can reach out better in terms of her positions to the average American voter in the middle of the map than Bernie Sanders. But she's not... She has a sort of Blair problem with the base of the Democratic Party. It's difficult to say who will win, but that is the debate that Democrats have to decide. Sanders is closer to Obama in his don't do stupid stuff approach to foreign policy. Don't get involved. If you can stay out of it, stay out of it. If you can accommodate. Hillary is more interventionist, internationalist, and assertive. What about the Republicans? So the Republicans, there are many more contenders, but you've got Trump, Carson, and Cruz in one corner, and you've got Rubio, Bush, Christie, and Lindsey Graham in the other corner. What do I mean by that? Those are Trump, Cruz, and Carson. Probably one of them will be remaining of those candidates, who will play off against one of Rubio, Bush, Christie, and Lindsey Graham. And they represent two different approaches. One I'd say is nationalist, which is Trump, Cruz, and Carson, and the other is internationalist. Okay, they're all conservative. but one is internationalist and one is nationalist on foreign policy. If you had to push me, I'd say that Ted Cruz will be the one to come out and actually Trump won't. And that we'll start to see much more of a fight between those two. And on the other side, I think that Rubio is the most likely candidate, and that's because the Republicans' base is white Southern evangelicals. Something like 75 to 80% of self-identifying Republicans are from the South, and they're white and they're evangelical. And to win a presidential election, they need to reach beyond that. And Rubio speaks Spanish, and Hispanics are the largest ethnic minority, and they're growing. And many of them serve in the armed forces, and people who served in the armed forces tend to be more Republican. So they have a chance there. So I would say that Rubio would be the guy to watch, but who knows exactly how it will play out. What's the difference between the nationalists and the internationalists? It kind of mirrors what's in the Democrats, in that the nationalists are basically saying, look, all the Republicans think the Iran deal is disastrous. Okay, they're all much more willing to use force than the Democrats. They're all willing to bomb Iran to stop it go nuclear. They're all willing to intervene where they perceive America's national security interests are directly threatened. Right? The difference is that the internationalists say, we need to work as American leadership of the world. We need to be the leader. We need to be in Syria. We need to be pushing back Assad. We need to be pushing back the Russians. We need to be pushing back ISIS. Some of them say boots on the ground, some of them don't. It's just a difference of degree. But America needs to lead. America needs to be assertive. America needs to be involved and leading and working with other countries and international institutions. If those institutions don't like what we do it anyway. We're conservatives, we're not liberals, right? But we need to be there. Whereas Ted Cruz says, let the Russians do what they want, right? Let them sort it out, right? I'm very sorry for the civilians in Syria, but it's not our problem. Iran's our problem, right? So we need to bomb it. And the Republican public leans more in the nationalist direction. But the more that they see a direct threat to America coming from the Middle East, so every time a bomb goes off in Paris, right, or someone in America, we saw that incident, the terrorist attack inspired by ISIS, that will make those people who are more nationalist than the Republicans think in terms of America needs to get more involved over there. Nobody is a Bush spread democracy, rebuild country state building. That's completely discredited. But that's the debate on both sides. So where does Israel fit in to all of this? Well, Israel fits in, first of all, is that everybody loves Israel, right? That there is no opinion being stated in any of these presidential primaries that is anything other than positive. It's less of an issue. The Democrats are not talking about it much, but the Republicans, every Republican candidate is trying to show that he is the most pro-Israel candidate. What's going on then? Well, it reflects basically not the power of a pro-Israel lobby. What it reflects is the fact that Israel's incredibly popular among Americans. 75% of Americans have a favorable view of Israel. Okay, about 20 to 25 maximum percent of Europeans have a favorable view of Israel. Right? In the last 15 years, Republicans and Democrats have become more sympathetic to Israel over the Palestinians. The most asked question in polling in America is, are you more sympathetic to Israel or Palestinians? Americans have become more sympathetic to Israel. Now, Republicans have become hugely more sympathetic to Israel. They're basically, it's 75, 80%. It's ridiculous numbers, right? But the Democrats have gone up as well. And even young Democrats over the last 15 years, their answers on that question are stable. They have not become less sympathetic to Israel, okay? When you ask a sympathy question. And that's to do with American identity and to do with what's going on in the Middle East. In shorthand, 9/11, ISIS, Iran, While, as we'll see, Republicans and Democrats disagree about policy, they don't disagree about who the good guys and who the bad guys are, and the threat. Republicans are much more sensitive to the threat from radical Islam and much more sensitive to the threat from Iran, and their feelings on this have doubled in intensity in the last 15 years, right? They've gone from being a narrow gap to a huge gap between Republicans and Democrats on how hawkish you should be and how much of a threat. But it's not that the Democrats see Islamic radicalism as less of a threat than they do. They do see it as more, right, than they did. It's just that Republicans hugely see it as more. So the gap in 2002 was maybe 11 percentage points on radical Islam. It's now double the difference between Republicans and Democrats. But Democrats have moved in the same direction, but they're in a different place. But for Americans, there's two reasons why they are so sympathetic to Israel, which don't really apply to the rest of the world. And that is because Americans identify with Israel, because there are two parts to American identity. One is that America was founded by Puritan Protestants, and they believed that to get close to God, you didn't need the Pope, you needed to read the Bible, and that meant you needed to learn Hebrew, and that meant Harvard and Yale was compulsory reading it Hebrew. Yale has Hebrew on its symbol, so does Dartmouth, so does Columbia on its seal. And the president of Yale, just after the Revolutionary War, gave his commencement speech in Hebrew. Okay, so Americans, including people who are not religious and not evangelical, that part of religion has seeped into America's national identity, so that Bill Clinton, his first trip to Israel was with his pastor. He has this sense, of Israel, and it's natural that the Jewish people want to return to their homeland. Truman had it, Johnson had it, Reagan had it. None of them particularly religious people, but it's just part of what seems normal to Americans. American non-Jewish Zionism precedes Jewish Zionism in Europe by 50 to 100 years. John Adams, second president of the US, says we need a Jewish state in the 1820s, okay, to resolve the problem of anti-Semitism. So in America, even a third of Catholics who theologically don't believe Israel has any significance believe, like Protestants, that the fact that in the Bible it says that the Jews received the land of Israel from God, that has some significance today to the Jews' right to the land. In other words, it's not religion, it's culture. The other side is that Israel's a democracy, and democracy matters more to American national identity than it does in Europe. In Europe, British people will say, what makes you British? They might say football, they might say the monarchy, they might say a lot of things. And then they ask them what your political values are, and they say democracy. But in America, the Constitution and democracy is what makes America America. It is constitutive of what it means to be an American. And Americans believe that spreading democracy is part of their national mission in life, and they have a sense of national mission. And this is not a left and right thing. If you listen to President Obama's inauguration speech, which I was at, it's an incredibly religious speech from a secular point of view about America's values and spreading those values. So where does Israel fit into this? It fits in because after the Second World War, there were very few democracies, and one of them was Israel. And of those democracies, only two have been democratic all the way through, India and Israel. And of those, only one of them was allied to the United States in the Cold War, Israel. So you had people like Eleanor Roosevelt saying, when she crossed from Jordan to Israel, I feel like I'm breathing the air of the United States again. 80% of Americans today believe that Israel and the United States share common values. And Americans say, who are we? We are a country founded by people fleeing religious persecution in Europe. We are pioneers and we set up a democracy. And they look at Israel and they say, so are they. So Ronald Reagan would say there is no country in the world like the United States except Israel. And 75% of Americans believe that the United States is exceptional, right? Exceptionally good from their point of view, right? So this is a very powerful thing. So on the one hand, Israel's never been, had more sympathy in the US than now. And those roots are incredibly deep. So that's the good times. What's the problem? The problem is that Americans have never been more divided about foreign policy and about policy to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that's because the Middle East is at the center of American foreign policy in a way that it wasn't during the Cold War, except for a very short period during the Yom Kippur War. In other words, all these central issues of foreign policy in America all revolve around the Middle East. The Iraq War, Islamic terrorism, Syria, the Iranian nuclear program. It's all there, and the parties are more divided, they're more polarized on how to deal with foreign policy than they have ever been before. And they're more ideologically polarized than they have ever been before. The Republicans became a conservative party about 15, 20 years ago. They previously there was a liberal wing of Republicans. The Democrats are now becoming a liberal party. When Gore ran in 2000, there were almost as many conservative Democrats as liberal Democrats. Today there are twice as many liberal Democrats as conservative Democrats, and liberals are the largest ideological group, and when they were not previously, moderates were. So the parties have really changed. They're really divided on foreign policy, the base of the parties, and so the number one issue is the Middle East, and Israel fits into that. So what does it mean? It means that among Republicans, there's a tendency to look at it like this. We share common values and common interests with the Israelis. We have common enemies. Israel's in the front line. We need to back Israel. Who's to blame for the conflict? Palestinians, Arab side, Islamic radicals. Do we support a two-state solution? We don't know. We're divided. What do we think about settlements? We don't know. We're divided. Okay, that's the base. If we look at Democrats, they say we increasingly strongly support a two-state solution because we believe in diplomacy, we believe in conflict resolution. We are very clearly against settlements. We're divided about who's to blame for the lack of peace. Is it both sides or is it the Palestinians? Very few will just say Israel. We're divided about who should we put the pressure on. Should it be both sides? Maybe a little bit more Israel, whereas for the Republicans, it's always the Palestinians. We're divided about how we should respond to the peace process. So the Republicans say, either it's up to Israel, you do what you want, or, okay, we support the peace process, but we lean towards Israel. The Democrats say, well, either we should be even-handed, or we should support the peace process, but we should lean to Israel. And the difference is that for Democrats, the weight, okay, they're more evenly divided, but the weight is a little bit lean towards even-handed. And that's the Obama, Bernie Sanders position. And the Hillary position is, I'm very strong on the peace process, but we always have to remember who our allies are, and we lean towards Israel on security. And that is not vastly different from the more internationalist Republicans, right, who are quite similar on that ground. So what you have is two different gut feelings about foreign policy and about Israel. What does this all mean for Israel? Well, Israel benefits from a United States that is active in the world. It shows leadership, is internationalist, and is prepared to be assertive. The reason is that if the United States isn't assertive in the Middle East, then nasty actors who are anti-Israel become more powerful, whether it's Russia, ISIS, Iran, in general terms. Whether exactly it's best that the United States intervenes more or less in Syria, that's a separate kind of, George W. Bush would say it's in the weeds, it's the details. But in the big picture, does Israel want a United States that sort of boosts the Sixth Fleet in the Eastern Mediterranean so that there's not going to be attacks on oil fields, gas fields, right? Or that the Turks are going to start pressuring Israel? Yes, it does. And therefore, from Israel's point of view, the more internationalist Hillary approach or the Rubio approach is better because it creates a balance of power that is better for Israel. It also creates a balance of power, I would argue, that's better for the West in general, right? Without getting into the details of exactly what you do as an orientation. So that's one side of it. And therefore, Israel would be worried about a US that withdraws more, okay? On the other hand, and I think that would be accepted across the spectrum in Israel, where Israelis would be divided would be about how interventionist Israel would like the US to be on the peace process. So the more nationalist candidates and Republicans, and the more kind of domestic orientated candidate on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders, they will take more of a hands-off approach. The Republicans will say, we love Israel, Israel's right, Israel can do what it wants, but we'll leave it to you, right? So the Israeli right would like that. Bernie Sanders would say, Israel needs to make the moves. It's up to Israel to stop settlements. It's up to Israel to be, to live up to its values and our values. But I'm not gonna, this is not the main thing. Okay. On the other hand, you get with the internationalists, there are two schools. One which says the peace process is a good thing. We need to move it forward if we can. But it has to be on terms that keeps Israel safe and strong and keeps the Middle East as a whole pro-American. We don't want to let the Russians in. We don't want to let Hamas in. If that's the price, it won't be peace. And it won't be good for America standing and the West standing in the region. Though that's people who advise on that would be the Dennis Rosses of the world, right? That's their worldview, or the Elliot Abrams of the world on the Republican side. The other view is called, in American parlance, the realists with a small r. And they think that if you can resolve the Middle East, if you can resolve the Arab-Israeli conflict, then everything will be all right. And so they are more willing to have an even-handed approach. Even-handed in American parlance means pressuring Israel, the focus. And you have people in the past, you'd have Bob Gates, who served in both administrations, who would take that view, or Colin Powell, or sometimes Condoleezza Rice, depending what years, right? That view is in retreat because of ISIS and because of what's going on in other places, but it's very powerfully institutionalized, and it will come back up. And the more a candidate is not driven by foreign policy, so Hillary knows what she thinks. It matters less who her advisors are. But a Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, right? It will matter much more who's telling them what to do, because they don't have a clear understanding or sense of what they think, except instinctively on these issues. I think the main challenge for Israel is on the Democratic side. And I'll finish with this. And that is that, as I said, Americans are just incredibly pro and sympathetic to Israel. It's really, really, if we take the least pro-Israel demographic in America, which is liberal, and put it to the most pro-Israel demographic in Europe, which is conservative, American liberals are more pro-Israel than European conservatives. Okay, just so we, get a sense. But what's happening on the Democratic side is that they are less and less in tune with Israeli security policy. Younger liberal Democrats are more dovish, much more critical of Israel's actions in Gaza. Older Democrats are more centrist. They have a view on the peace process that clashes with the Israeli right, but on security, there's not that much of a difference. Between Israel and Hillary Clinton, there's not going to be much of a difference. Okay? Hillary said on the Iran deal, she's going to distrust and verify, which is a play on Ronald Reagan's thing of trust and verify. But she's showing that she's going to be much tougher and much more willing to use force, and that's much more reassuring from Israel. The problem is that the base and younger people, and they're growing, and there are now more liberals, and they're more dovish. For them, Israel's credibility on the peace process and the two-state solution, and particularly settlements, is a threshold issue. If Israel's seen as credible on this, right, it doesn't have to withdraw tomorrow, it doesn't have to do somersaults, it just has to be credible, reasonable, then the ears open up to Israeli claims on security, what the other side's doing, all sorts of things. And it won't matter whether there is a disagreement. Because, okay, reasonable people can disagree exactly about what the security policy should be, but we're friends and we'll have those discussions in private, and they can get very, they can be very, very vociferous and serious political crisis, but it will not damage the special relationship. You know, Kissinger put more pressure on Israel than anybody else. It only strengthened the special relationship afterwards. In other words, the difference between a crisis and a crisis of the special relationship is two different things. So if Israel is over the threshold on its credibility, that it's willing, if it can really get peace and security, to make concessions in the territorial zone, then it will not have a problem with Democrats, despite the growing divide on attitudes. If, on the other hand, it's not seen as crossing that threshold, it erodes what I call the ozone layer of the special relationship, which is bipartisanship. That is something that is currently being degraded, right? It's the ozone layer, so you don't notice it. In Congress, everybody loves Israel. But among the base, there's a degrading because of Israel's credibility on this issue. And it's something that Israelis don't sufficiently understand. In that when you poll Israelis and you ask them, why does America so supportive of Israel? A majority say because Israel's a strategic ally. And indeed, a majority of Americans say the main reason we support Israel is because it's a strategic ally. But the second reason in America, the second most powerful region, is Israel's a democracy. Israelis give that 5% importance, right? As Israelis underestimate the importance of Israel as a democracy in terms of the US-Israeli relationship. And I'm going to finish on that note. Thank you very much.